Good evening, everybody. I need a gavel. A whistle? I can't whistle. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Steve Kleppen. I'm the Planning and Zoning Director for the city. As you know, we're doing a series of meetings throughout the city, different voting districts, and as well as different neighborhood groups to talk about proposed zoning changes that we're working on. So just the order of business tonight, I'm going to give you kind of like the purpose and the background of why we're doing this. Big picture changes to the zoning regulations, then focusing on changes to the district that you guys are part of, District C, and then talk about the process and next steps of where we go from here. So why are we doing this in general? So in 2019, the city adopted a new plan of conservation and development called the Citywide Plan. So a good goal when you do those kind of things is to align your zoning with the plan itself. The plan has a future land use map in it, which is kind of a guide. It's not set in stone as a Bible, for example, but it does provide guidance on how you should govern your city in terms of land use. So we tried to match up the zoning the best with that as possible. Anybody who's ever looked at Norwalk zoning regulations before will know that it's a very convoluted, disjointed, and not well put together document. It's not straightforward in that you could go to one section and then really understand all the ramifications and issues related to your property or the issue you're looking at. It jumps back to several sections. It's not clear that you have to go to that section, so it's easy to miss things. So that's kind of just from a practical structural point of view why we do this. The current regulations and map, there's over 31 zones in the city right now. That's a lot of zones. There's a total of 5 individual single-family zones, as well as hybrid zones between 1 and 2, and then multifamily. So there's a lot of different and unnecessary overlap. So we'd like to come up with something that is a little simpler. So I know if you've looked at the document so far, you might say, well, this doesn't seem simple to me. I'll say, yes, I would agree with you, but over time, I think it will be easier and simpler to navigate through. So this is an example of what I was talking about with the zoning map. Can you guys hear me in the back? Does this look weird? Looks good. So with the zoning map itself, this is the current zoning map. On the left in the circle is the legend for the map. And as you can see, that's all the different zones. So if you look at the kind of the zoom in on the right, that's just a section along Main Ave. And you can see that just why are there so many zones in such a short area? And all the zones have just different designations where B is a single family, C is 1 to 2, A is single family, and then that red color below, that's a multi-family. So why is there the pattern developed this way? There's not really a good rhyme or reason in a lot of cases why it was developed that way. So as I mentioned, we want to make sure the POCD lines up with our zoning. Over time, we'd like to get that done. Some overarching philosophies that we followed is we try to center and focus our development around our infrastructure, our mass transit, and our job centers. We feel that's a kind of a smart growth policy that just kind of makes sense. If you think about it, why develop out in the AAA zone when there's no infrastructure, the road network's not meant to handle it, there's no sewer, everybody's on septic. So we kind of thinking that's kind of the outskirts of the city more or less. And then as you get closer to the downtown areas, that's where you want to focus your development. Another recommendation with the POCD is looking at what's called a form-based code. Our current code is the Euclidean zoning code, and that's based on a lawsuit from years ago. Euclidean zoning basically separates land uses by their types and kind of separates uses out, saying you can't put a gas station next to my house and so forth. So it kind of separates uses, where the form-based code looks more at the form and function of the buildings and the streetscape and how it relates to the building, and worries a little less about uses. It does regulate use, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, but it focuses more on the massing, scope, and scale of the buildings and the street and how those two interact with each other. As I mentioned, here's just a map of kind of focus areas of where we do development in the city. The kind of the main focus areas, as you probably see from driving around, South Norwalk is where a lot of investment and development occurs in and around the train station. We're also doing a lot of work in the West Ave Wall Street corridor, and that's starting to hopefully blossom and kind of help bring that area back over time. And then we also have done some pretty significant rezoning up at the Merritt 7 station in trying to, the idea of trying to support the office towers there, which is the city's highest concentration of Class A office space. There's a new train platform going in up there, so we're hoping that can kind of foster into a TOD area. Two other areas I'd say on the less intensive, on the moderate side for development. One is the East Norwalk area around the train station. You're probably a lot of you familiar with that discussion. And also looking at how do we redevelop the Route 1 corridor. Anybody who's gone to Westport and Darien along Route 1 knows there's a significant difference when you hit the town lines in those two areas. Why are those areas, why do those areas look the way they do, and why does Norwalk's Route 1 look the way it does? It's simply because we allow it to look that way. So what we'd like to do with the form-based code is kind of change the aesthetic and the way it functions from a pedestrian standpoint throughout the whole corridor. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. That might take 30 years, it might take 40 years. But as properties redevelop, the aesthetic should change. So what you'll see in the future will be parking to the rear or the side. You won't go down the road and just see a sea of asphalt with the store 300 yards back from the street. You'll see more unified and better building design. You're going to see a unified streetscape as well as unified signage, because that's another thing that's really distracting and aesthetically unpleasing when you go along Route 1. It's just sizes of signs, the look of signs. So there's a lot of things that we can clean up just through our zoning code itself. I went through this, I kind of jumped ahead a little bit on the slides. But the one nice thing with the form-based code is it's got a lot of graphics and a lot of charts. And so I think the visuals are helpful in terms of what the buildings can look like, what we're expecting you to do on your property, what you can do on your property. So form-based code is kind of based on what they're calling transects. And this is, some of this is relevant to Norwalk, but not all of it's relevant to Norwalk, because they break each district they call, it's CD stands for community use district. So all the nomenclature that you might be used to, AAA, AA, single A, all that is disappearing. There's all new zones with all new designations. So on the far left, you can see what's called CD1. That's like, might be in the middle of Wyoming. It's not going to be applicable to Norwalk. So we have, where we start in Norwalk is CD3, and there's a couple of different CD3s in our new regulations. There's CD3L, which basically translates to the existing AAA zone. There's a CD3S, which is a consolidation of our existing AA and single A zones. And then there's a CD3, which I'm going to talk about in more detail later, but that's a 1 or a 2 family zone. And then when you start to progress, you have there's a bunch of different CD4 zones and CD5 zones. So CD4, probably a good example of that is where you might have some multifamily housing or your neighborhood business now, that's a CD4 zone. South Norwalk, West Ave, Wall Street, that's going to be what we have as our CD5. That's kind of identified as the city's urban core. And we don't have, and beyond that, there are things like CD6, but that's like Manhattan level density. We don't have any approach to that. There are also special districts. So we have Norwalk hospitals in a special district. Our industrial zones are in special districts. And what's not shown on here is we also have a civic district. And the civic district is meant to capture governmental properties. And that can include city-owned, state-owned, or taxing district property. And the intent of that zone is to provide flexibility for government uses in those zones, but also being cognizant, like if you're out in the AAA zone and there's a civic zone next to you, you don't want to be infringed upon by what might happen on that property. So there's standards built into the civic zone to protect the neighboring properties. So here's an example of what the CD3 zone looks like. And this kind of format is followed through every zone. So this would just be, I'm just showing you just some screenshots of what it looks like. On the left is the cover page for that, the CD3 zone. The next page you'll see is kind of deals with building location on the property. So it's saying, here's your building envelope. So very similar terminology to what we use now in terms of setbacks. So it defines, how close the building can be to the front, the side, or the rear property line. It also regulates building height, but we do that a little differently now, and it also regulates how much building can occupy a property and how we kind of view the property. So right now, all our single-family zones really relate to the size of a property. We regulate it. So if you had like 4 acres in the AAA zone and you wanted to subdivide your property, you would have to meet lot width requirements on the streets. You have to have a certain amount of width on the street, plus a certain amount of property, acreage on the property. But when you're going down the street, you don't visualize acreage, you visualize the width of the property. So if I'm driving down to see the houses, I can tell get a sense of this person's property is here, this person's property is here, and this person's property is here, by where the building is and how it relates to the street. You have no idea how deep that property is until you kind of look at like an aerial view or some kind of treetop view to get a sense of that. So what we're doing now is just regulating the width of the property. There's going to be a lot circle requirement within there, so we don't see a proliferation of subdivisions. I know that's a concern expressed by some. In addition, the regulations no longer allow rear lots. So if you were in an area that had, big piece of property behind you, if you don't have the width of the street, you can't develop that anymore for a lot. We do think there'll be, in some instances, I think the only areas where there might be in the future the ability to add a lot is if somebody's on the corner where they have 2 streets that intersect and they have a lot of width on one street and a lot of width on another street. So they might be able to add a lot there now, which you probably couldn't at present. Another thing I should highlight is the building heights. We don't regulate strict building height. And so right now the building height may be 35 feet in the regulations. We're regulating the numbers of stories versus that. And the reason is nobody can really accurately say what the height is. I could go down the street and I can't say, well, that's 40 feet versus that's 35. You can't really perceive that. What you perceive are the number of stories. So we regulate the number of stories, but we regulate the height within the story. So you can have a taller first floor, and then you have a certain height on the second floor. What we tried to do was match up those floor heights with the heights that exist in the current regulations for total. So we're not trying to add height in areas at all. So we're trying to match it up with this. I talked about the use table, and I can zoom in later. I apologize if you can't see the top screen, top part of the screen. But across the top are all the zones, proposed zones within the city. It starts from CD3L and then ends at the civic zone. So what you'll see here is this table is about 20 pages long. This shot I have up here is just the residential uses. All the uses are broken down by just different classifications. There's residential, there's industrial, there is retail, commercial, there's office. And so what this chart shows are different categories. And the easy ones are P, which is for permitted, NP for not permitted, SPU, which means it's a special permit use, which is similar terminology to what we use today. And then there's PL, which means it's permitted with limitations. So if something is permitted with limitations, at the end of the use table, the ones that have a PL next to them, they are all in alphabetical order, and it'll tell you what the limitations are. So the limitation might be, for example, and I'm kind of making this up, so don't hold me to this. There might be something for elderly housing. That's one I actually happen to know pretty good because we worked with the commission a few years ago. The elderly housing is probably only allowed in a certain zone if it meets a certain lot requirement and has all these other caveats attached to it. So that's kind of what the PL is. And the PL right now is kind of similar to how we handle site plan applications. That's all defined in the regulations. You'll see this table goes through, like I said, all the different uses. And I think this is an easier format for people to follow as opposed to the current regulations. I didn't provide a screenshot of that, but basically you would go to the zone and it would just list all the uses. And none of them are in alphabetical order. So it's very confusing. Over time, as people use this will be an easier format. So another thing that's within the regulations, which I think will be helpful, is there's a whole chart of building typology. And so, and this is again, I pulled some of the residential building types just for kind of simplicity purposes. And it kind of defines what that building is. And on the right-hand side, it tells you what zone those buildings are about. I think that's a useful tool that will help. This is just a zoom in of what a duplex is. It kind of gives some parameters of a duplex. It has to be 2.5 stories, gives the maximum width of what the duplex is, kind of gives some additional background and detailed information. So that's the same for all the different building types. It ranges from big box store to industrial building down to a cottage. So it kind of runs the gamut. So some of the big picture changes, and I highlighted on a few of these. So the AAA zone, by and large, did not change very much. The standards within that zone are consistent, and the reason they're consistent is because that area, as I mentioned, a lot of it doesn't have infrastructure. They're all, a lot of them are on septic, so it doesn't make sense to try to apply a form-based format to those properties. They kind of, leave those alone for the most part. We have consolidated, as I mentioned, the AA, the AA, the A, and some of the B zone properties. Those again are all single family districts. And those got consolidated into what's called the CD3S zone. And so one thing that's important to note with the A and the AA, they both have the same lot width requirement in the existing regulations. So that parameter doesn't change from the new regs to the old regs. One change that does occur is that the setbacks are a little bit different on the side. So we're going to have a clause in the regulations that if you have a house in the B zone and you go up to the combined new CD3S zone, you go by the former standards for that zone. So we're not going to penalize you, and we don't want 5,000 variance out. That's not our intent. But if somebody was to tear down a house in the B zone, that got eventually up zone, they have to conform to the new standards of the zone. It's just if they're working off their existing house and you've been dreaming for years, you want to put on master suite off the side, you're not going to get penalized with a new setback. We're trying to be fair about this and not penalize it, not create extra work for ourselves. What we'll spend more time on later, but one thing that's come up a lot in the meetings we've had so far is combining of a lot of the B resident zone. So the B resident zone split not quite 50-50 between the single family into what is now the CD3 zone, which is a 1 or a 2 family zone. Some important things to point out. It's not an increase in density because right now in the B zone, you can do ADUs, whether they're attached or detached as of right. If you do a 2-family in this new CD3 zone, you don't get to do any ADUs, and we're not increasing the density at all. Important to note with the 2-family in the new zone, that has to provide compliant parking on site. That parking has to be to the side or the rear, cannot be in the front yard. So I can't control how many cars somebody has on the property. They have 3 kids are home from school and they all have a car and they're parking on the street overflowing. I can't control that. That's not a zoning matter. I can't control where the required parking spaces are supposed to go. And so the new regulations require those spaces to be to the side of the rear. One nice thing also with the 2-family, it has to follow the form-based code, whereas an ADU, if it's detached, can be in the backyard, closer to the setback, and potentially more impactful on the neighborhood. The 2-family dwelling could lead to more uniform design over time. Another nice factor with the 2-family is it has the potential for additional homeownership. You can't say somebody will do that, but somebody could condominiumize a duplex, for example, where I own one half and you own the other half, where an ADU, you can't do that. The owner has to own owns the property. I'm going to take questions at the end. I'm sorry.
Definition.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, good question. ADU is accessory dwelling. So that's something that's been on the zoning regulations for a long time, but was modified last fall and again. So we think that's kind of a nominal change. I mentioned this a little earlier. We've kind of consolidated the zoning. I'm going to show you on a map from the Wall Street area down to South Norwalk, where the TOD boundary currently exists. The zoning is largely the same now. There are 6 different zones between Wall Street and at the southern border of the TOD in South Norwalk. And it doesn't make sense to have all these different zones when they really say the same thing. So we kind of tried to do things to uniform, make the design more uniform, and make the rules more uniform. Yeah, so right now, the map on the left is the proposed zoning map, so that kind of purple color, that shows that consolidation from, this is like the boundary, the southern boundary of the existing TOD zoning, and at the top is kind of the Wall Street northern boundary of where things exist. So we consolidated that to one zone. The green in the middle, that's the civic zone. So those are city properties or state properties that are talked about. That's the only difference. As you can see on the map on the right, just look at the color pattern here. It's just kind of crazy. It doesn't make sense. There's five, actually there's more than 6 zones. There's 5 Putnams. I have no idea why there's 5 Putnams. People were trying to master plan overcomplicated. So right now we have what's called the Business 1 and the Business 2 zone. Those are basically along the Route 1 corridor at Main Ave. They function the exact same. There's very little difference between the two, so we consolidated that into one zone, which is now the called CD4C, which is basically the commercial zone. And over time, I mentioned this, the idea will, with the form-based code, will lead to more uniform design, better streetscape, better signage, building development. Something we'll talk about in a little more detail in a little bit when we talk about the East Norwalk area specifically, is we consolidated the D zone, which is a smaller multifamily, and the neighborhood business zone, which was kind of a catch-all zone for some different things. So we consolidated those zones. The only big change of what that does is it does allow 3.5 stories as of right versus the 2.5 in the areas that were formerly neighborhood business. So I know that'll be a little change for folks. Talked about the civic zone a little bit, so I won't go over it again. You might see on the map, on certain areas of Norwalk Harbor, there are areas with a TBD designation to be determined. We did a waterfront plan a little over a year ago. We've been working with town council changes to some of the parcels in there. So before this process gets wrapped up, we'll finalize the zoning on that. We have a conversation about that next steps with them. Getting closer to the end of this piece. We talked about the number of stories already. Right now, we regulate on residential properties something called lot coverage, which basically is the amount of building a property, like your house, can occupy on the site. So it doesn't, you can't fill up your entire property with a big house building. We're removing that standard and putting in something called impervious surface coverage, which regulates the building as well as parts of it. So the driveway. Because right now, there's nothing to prevent somebody from basically putting up their house and paving over their entire property. So that obviously leads to runoff problems. It's not good for water filtration and drainage, so we put in some standards to address that. So it still allows people to do lots of things on the property, but it doesn't lead to asphalt, complete payroll. There are regulations in new zoning about tree removal, site grading. What happens a lot, and maybe you've experienced this in your neighborhood, is when somebody buys a house next to you, they may tear that house down. And if they do that, they tend to mound up the property quite a bit, because a lot of times houses built in the 60s were built on a very flat plane, or sometimes even truss plane. So the new development, typically they ramp it up a little bit so the water sheds and doesn't pond at the foundation. So there's nothing in the zoning regulations right now that deals with that runoff and that grade. And so somebody could theoretically fill 10 feet, and then that's just going to cause more problems for everybody that's downstream. So we have regulations in the new zoning that would tell you how much you can do, and then tell you how you have to really rate the drainage aspect. There's also changes to the flood zone regulations. We're increasing the neighbor notification requirements now. Right now, the existing zoning only requires you to notify the immediate butter. For certain types of applications, we're also requiring a sign, a physical sign in place on the property, which would tell you there's something happening here. Here's where you go find the information. That's spelled out what they have to do with regulations. Relating to commercial properties, we no longer regulate, what's called FAR, which is floor area ratio. That's similar to building coverage. It doesn't apply to residential properties. It applies only to commercial properties. So basically, if you had a 10-story building, it measures the volume of each one of those floors and says that can only be a certain percent of the building. It's really an antiquated metric because what really regulates how big the building is the number of stories and the parking. So that's how we're going to regulate that. So what's happening specifically to District C? So you might recall there were some changes to the industrial zones that were passed that affected areas in the Long Beach Norwalk. No changes to what was approved in that area. The boundaries of those areas all remain the same. I mentioned the consolidation of the CD4, consolidation of the D residence zone and the neighborhood business into the new CD4 zone. So there are areas, particularly the East Norwalk Village TOD zone that was enacted, that does allow 3.5 stories as of right now. The density doesn't change at all. So, you know, the driver for development is going to be the density, not the height, because height just costs money or density gets money. So that is a change, but you know, we did that just for the purposes of consolidating the zones. There's a very small, I think 3 or 4 property expansion of the EPTC on the southern east of Van Zandt, where it all about change of these boundaries. That's not a lot of discussion. A little bit, we had conversations about this last week. I had conversations about this last month as well. Is the creation of what the CD3 zone. So right now, the C residence zone is a 1 or 2 family zone. If you have a 6,000 square foot block with a 2 family, it's less than that. One of the goals of the rezoning and recommendation of the citywide plan was to provide more housing opportunity, housing choices, particularly as what's been called missing middle housing. So Norwalk does a good job of providing multi. A lot of that, not everybody likes it, but there's a lot of choices in that regard. But the smaller scale projects, like the 2 family up to like 10 family, there's a little less of that. And so what we're doing with the CD3 zone is allowing the potential for somebody to build a 2 family. Just because you can do a 2 family doesn't mean you have to do it. What we've seen from our work, and I have data on this, is even areas that have had the ability to do 2 family housing for 100 years, less than half of it has gone. And I think the reason is it's really a market choice. We had this discussion last night at Shoretown Park. They were very concerned about them. But the reality is, a lot of the property south of there that could have done it just chose not. I think it's just based on the location and what's most marketable for us. We can't say what will happen, but we think it at least provides the opportunity for additional homeownership or active ownership. Buy a 2 family and they can own half of it, whereas an ADU would not provide that. A single family might be too expensive for them. So I'm going to look at just zoom into a few different areas throughout the district to show you some of the map changes. The larger maps are all around the back of the room if you want to look at those afterwards. But the map changes on here are really highlighting. This is up more towards Westport Ave, and you can see the map on the right is the existing zoning. As I mentioned, the A and the B are single family zoning, and then on the left, what you see here is some of the new zoning in terms of, the labels didn't work great on this, but that kind of orange color there, that's the CD3, where the, I want to call it, this color here, that's a yellowish beige color, that's a single family zone, that's the CD3S zone. What we try to do, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, in terms of where to determine where the boundaries should be for these new zones, 1 to 2 family zone or where the multi-family zone starts. So in principle, around our transit hubs, we try to have that most density around like the South Norwalk train station. Then as you fan out, then you have allows multifamily, but a lot less dense multifamily. Then as it fans out from there, you have the option to do the 1 or 2 family, and then you start to get more dispersed and it's a single family zone. Around like the Route 1 corridor, for example, we tried to apply roughly a quarter-mile buffer to allow 1 or 2 family dwellings. That's that orange color just south of the red along Westport Avenue. It doesn't always line up with the quarter-mile because we didn't want to split streets when we could. We wanted to try to keep lots and things more unified. So it's not a perfect quarter-mile. Some areas it's far less, in some areas it's a little bit. Next area is a little bit further south of this. You can see this is East Ave through here. This is the East Avenue, East Federal Rock Village TOD zone. So the TOD zone doesn't go away. It's the extra layer of oversight in terms of building design and requirement to gain the extra density stays within the draft regulations. But what we did is, so on the right again is the existing. The B is single family. And then what's kind of odd is what you can see on the right-hand side, you have this kind of areas that are labeled I2. Those are the industrial zones that fan out. I think it's Dooney and Burke and somebody else up in that area. As you fan out to the south of that, it's two-family zone. But to the north of that, it's one-family zone. And then to the east of the C-family zone, it goes back to one-family zone again. So there's not like a consistent pattern. So what we tried to do was consolidate where you could do the one and two family. So that area kind of to the north up through here, they consolidated and took the B and put it in with the C. So you have the option or ability to do one or a two family in those areas. Again, just to reiterate this, you're not required to do it. It's just the option to do it if that's something you'd like to do. Next area is to the west of East Avenue. By and large, the C zone on this map kind of matches up pretty well with the two-family zone under the new zoning. There was a little bit of pocket of one family up close to 95. We pulled that in. It doesn't make, I'm trying to eliminate these little pockets of one different zone. Just it doesn't make sense from a land use or ease of use perspective. If somebody's a potential buyer of property or realtor, it just kind of simplifies things a little bit. One change on the southern portion is you'll see this purple color through here. That's the new CD4 zone, which is a multifamily zone. That's the consolidation of a way oversight. That's the consolidation of those two zones. And just to the right of that, to the east of that, we did pull in a little bit of the two-family zone, current two-family zone into the multifamily zone to kind of fix the pattern. It's not a large area. It's just kind of that block of south of Cottage. There's also when we took the like first Street area, Cove Ave area, and we put that into similar zone in terms of the allowed height. So we were not trying to do anything to change that area. We put it into a new CD4W, which we think is a more protective zone. This might be the last area, which I kind of just came to. As I mentioned, that CD4W is kind of a protected area for that area as well as Landmark Square. And the only other kind of area that gets changed into the new two-family zone is this little block right through here on Seaside Place. As you can kind of see on the map on the right, which the existing zoning, it's kind of like a little peninsula of just single-family zones, and but it might make sense from a consolidation standpoint to back to the one or two. So I'm like very close to the end. Thank you for your patience. So kind of where we are now is we're doing meetings like this. We did 2 last night, myself and Brian Baker in my office. I have a couple next week. He's got a couple next week. So we're meeting with, working through your council members, working through the neighborhood associations. I think the NNA is May 15th. And we're also going to the different land use boards, as well as we'll be setting up some meetings with some of the land use professionals, attorneys, engineers, architects who wants to come in and ask questions and chat. They've already found some things that don't make sense, so we'll make edits and corrections along the way as we have to. And what's going to happen when we get through these meetings, which will probably run into June as requests come in, we're happy to meet and chat with folks. Can't say we're going to do every one of these at night, but we'll have to do it today as well. The Planning and Zoning Commission will hopefully finalize these dates tomorrow night. We'll hold 2 public hearings in June. I think I'm going to push for the 21st and the 28th. One of those is one of their regular meetings already. Those are not adoption hearings. Those hearings are just to get public input. We understand we can't do anything in July or August. So I think what will happen is over time, the July and August, the commission will kind of look at what's been proposed. I'm going to show you how you can give us feedback. Well, I'm going to show you how you can give us some feedback. What we're going to do with all that feedback is, so we have an online form I'll show you in a second, but we're going to take all that information, it downloads to kind of like a spreadsheet format. We won't alter anybody's information that they put in, but we are going to add a staff response to each one of those comments. We'll post those on the website as well as give that to the commission and let the commission decide what they want to do with those comments. And so there'll be a matrix that the commission works off of possible changes. So I think that's it. I'm going to show you the web page for more information, and I'll turn it over to you guys and whoever is on virtually that wants to ask questions. Well, my email is here. It's also on the city's web page. You can, feel free to email me with any questions you have. So just give me a second. I'm going to switch. I think I have it set up how I want it. So this is the City of Norwalk main page. You guys still hear me in the back? So this is the City of Norwalk main page. You can just navigate to the planning and zoning page. So we set up a separate page just to deal with the zoning rewrite. We had, our consultant had a zone Norwalk page set up for the kind of beginning phase of the project. We're kind of phasing that site out and shifting everybody to here where we'll have all the information. So at the beginning is just kind of some, So at the beginning is some explanatory text of why we're doing what we're doing and how to kind of navigate this page. So as you scroll past that, we have, there's links on the left, but there's also these tabs here. These are information sheets. Hopefully these answer a lot of the questions. So you can click on this one, for example. So it's kind of the why we're doing this project and what the heck is form-based code. So that's one of the options. There's one that explains changes to the building bulk and height standards. There's a page that explains changes to the zoning map. Probably not as much detail for each specific area, but it gives overall changes. There's a page that talks about the outreach, which I'm going to click on to show you some of those changes. And we're going to update this. What I think we're going to do is, so the consultant at the beginning of April gave a couple presentations at meetings. We'll take all those links, YouTube links, and we'll post them here, as well as all these meetings we're recording. So the commission and the public can go back and look at any one of these meetings over time if they need it for reference. We have the schedule. This might be a little out of date because we've added a couple of meetings at the end of May, but for the most part, this will get updated and shows all the meeting dates. And just talks about the process. And so how do you provide comment? I talked about this a little bit. There is a couple different links you can click on. There's a form that pops up. It just kind of asks basically who you are, gives you some ideas and options of what the article of the regulations your question is about, and then gives you the ability to type whatever you want to type in there. And all that gets downloaded into a spreadsheet. And then just below that is the actual regulation. So we've broken it down by the different articles because it's a big document. It's not small, so it takes a little bit to download. The whole document is there as well if you wanted to download the whole thing, but each article is there individually. What most people I think are going to be interested in is the zoning map. What does this mean for me? Where do I live and how does this affect me? So this image on the left is a static zoning map, kind of a standard PDF. You click on it and you can zoom in. But what we've also done, which I think works a little bit better is we put an interactive map together. If it loads, there you go. Up will pop a little disclaimer saying you will read and understand that what you're doing here is good. Somebody want to volunteer an address? I can do this address. So keep in mind when you put this in, make sure you click on Norwalk because this is a GIS database which pulls nationally. So you might pull East Avenue and Oshkosh. So just make sure you click on Norwalk. So that zooms into where we are at City Hall. You can see that here's where we are, kind of right here. So you click on your parcel. And this is just a little quirk in the program. It might pop up proposed zoning first, or it might pop up the existing zoning first. Luckily, the last 2 nights, it's popped up the proposed zoning first. So it's telling you that your property is proposed to go into the civic zone. So you're going to say, what the heck is the civic zone? Well, you're going to click on the link just below that. And then it's going to take you to the civic zone. And then it tells you everything you need to know about the civic zone. And so the other thing we put underneath there is the use table. And so here's a link to the use table. This is kind of a explanatory preamble to tell you how to use the use table. And here's that use table I was talking about. And now I can zoom in and show you what I was talking about earlier with the various uses. Can you guys see that? Or is that far? So across the top, again, here's all the zones within the new zoning districts. And this is the residential areas, which is the same shot I had up before. And it tells you whether something's permitted, not permitted, permitted by special permit, or permitted with limitations. So if you go back to this page, at the top, there's this little arrow. That tells you what your existing zone is right now. So that will take you to a link to the zoning regulations, and you'll click on that link and you say, oh my God, these old regulations are horrible. I'm glad they're doing these new regulations. And we also have a link to the bulk and height standard. So that'll tell you how big the building can be and all those things. So you can get a comparison of what you can do to what you're allowed to do under the new regulations. And I am done. I apologize, I went long. So I'm happy to take questions. If you want questions, I just would ask, come up to the microphone so the public can see you from the camera here, and actually you can broadcast out over the Zoom recording. I'm going to also see anybody that wants to go online and ask a question. You can simply use the raise your hand button at the bottom of the screen, and I can allow you to speak. Let me take this. I'm going to grab my water, but feel free to start.
Can you tell us how many people are on Zoom?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
But I think I'm going to guess like 15 plus the panelists. Nobody's got comments, questions, complaints. This is, you're letting me off way into this. I was hoping for a hostile. Sure. If you just don't mind giving me your name. Just state your name.
Yeah, Mike Valiant. The present zoning, if I'm right, for a condominium, the parking, what is required for a 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom condominium?
So we don't regulate it by bedrooms, we regulate it by units. So a unit can be 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms, whatever.
All right, if it was 3 bedrooms, how many parking spaces are required?
So for a single family house or a condo, so say you did a duplex, right? You built a condo or a townhouse and you did 3 or 4 of them. It's multifamily parking, which is 3 or more, is 1.3 spaces per unit. That's existing code. A duplex is 2 per unit, or a single family is 2 per unit. ADUs, you have to add 1 additional space for an ADU.
Which one was the 1.3?
That's for multifamily. So 3 or more units. And that's the
So
current.
if a developer built a, let's use a round figure number of a 10-unit multifamily apartment building, how many parkings are required? 1.3 times 10?
Yeah, which I think is 13.
Do you really feel that's enough?
Yeah, that's the number we have on the books. It's been on the books for.
I know that it's been on books, but that was, years ago, it was different around here. I remember, I think it's the condominium over by the hospital where there was parking on the road there. That's US 1. I don't think you were here then. And then they took that away. And that development, I think it's called Highview condominium. It was required one parking space per unit. Okay. Since they took that away from the parking on the road, people there, they were parking in the visitors parking and all over the place. My main question is, I would think that because of these new developments based on the new zoning, that the parking would be more than what the old parking was. In other words, not 1.3, either maybe 2 parking spaces or 3 per unit. I mean, 1.3 sounds very minimal.
So the trend nationally, it's not a Norwalk thing or a Connecticut thing. The trend nationally is less parking than more parking in terms of requirement. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of those, if you're trying to build, and I understand there's different between the scales of developments between like a 10-unit project versus a 100-unit project. But the idea, like one of the things we're trying to foster with the TOD zoning is trying to make it a more walkable community where you're not relying on a motor vehicle. So and I know that's a behavioral thing. We can't always change that and it doesn't always apply, but that's kind of one of the concepts.
Let me ask you another question. Some of these large developments that we see around town where the big buildings, like there's 150 units.
Yeah.
Let's say there's 100, let's say use a round number for 200 units are going to be built. What are the parking requirements for the 200 units?
It's the same for they fall.
1.3?
Or yeah, but there is a provision. They can go down to 1 per unit.
Oh,
If they do, there's some caveats with that. It depends on location, depends on what they do for what we call workforce housing.
I remember the old days. A lot of families have 1 car for the whole family. Today, I'm seeing a lot more than that. You have 3 teenagers, parents, they all have cars. That's why I'm okay with development in a town or a city. But to me, the streets are very important. The streets have to be wide because people are now parking on the streets of our old streets that are narrow. And I could drive you around town and show you these streets. You put on these streets at night, there's cars all over the place. And you could just get by driving down the road, especially 2 cars coming both ways. So I would think that any kind of major development, you have to take in the size of the street. Some are narrower, some are wider. But to me, the best street is the widest street where you can park on both sides and 2 cars can go, past each other going up and down. I'm really surprised that the zoning didn't change on the parking requirements.
Yeah, I mean, with something, to be honest with you, I think the conversations we had were going the opposite direction. But I understand.
They were talking about people, walking around. Is that what they're thinking?
Yeah, it's requiring less.
Well, that's somebody's opinion. I mean, if you took a poll on that, I don't know.
Well, I can tell you the 1 point. I can tell you the 1.3 number.
Yeah.
Actually pencils out really well. That was done by my office many years ago. They actually did occupancy counts at different times of the day and night. And on the larger developments, the 1.3 was very solid. Some of the developments, like some of the Waypoint projects, are way over parked and have, decks of parking that just aren't used.
Let me just get this clear one more time.
Sure.
On a duplex, 2 units side by side, is 2 spaces per unit
4 total.
for a total of 4, and that's it. Okay.
There's something else that like the East Norwalk Village TOD plan had recommended, and the city's starting to talk about now, is permit parking for residential permit parking, which I think would get at your concern, saying, I've got, I have my house and I've got my 4 kids are home and they all have a car, and my aunt's here, she's got a car, and they're all over the place. That's what the residential parking pass program could potentially deal with.
At least they've been talking about that, yeah.
Yeah, that's something I can't say will happen and when, but it's something the city's talking about. Because it does pop up. And I know East Norwalk and the streets, First Street, Second Street down through there, they're very, I understand those are 50, 60-foot wide lots. So
That's it.
drive, they were built in the 50s and 60s when, to your point, there was one car.
I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Let's go to the large developments. I'm thinking of the one on Water Street where there's parking underneath these large, either condos or apartments. There's parking underneath. Is there a visitor parking space for visitors?
Some of them designate visitors.
Just some? I mean, it's not a requirement?
No, because there's formulas in the existing regulations and also within the proposed regulations about shared use and mixed use ratios, because there's other things going on in the buildings besides the residential. And also in that area in particular, that's a TOD area. And so the idea is you're near the train station. So we're hoping some people actually take the train and commute and do those kind of things.
That one there really gets me, that there's no visitor parking. So where would visitors park if they're going to go visit somebody?
Well, I mean, that's.
And let's say in a lot of those streets, there's no parking signs.
That's pretty common in urban settings. I mean, if you go into most cities, you don't get to park at the building. You have to park at a municipal facility or a private facility. Yep. Anybody else? Oh, online? Usually somebody else is doing this. So. I'm going to try to bring you over. I apologize, but I can't get you over. I always need to know, yes, but it's not, I'm guessing he didn't, I don't think he made me a host. So if he didn't make me a host, I can't. Usually you just right click. And oh, yeah, hold on. Thank you. All right. Linnell, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Can you hear me? You can. Am I right or wrong in that if the parking requirement is lowered, that also lowers the required handicap parking spaces? So in the example that the gentleman gave before for the 10 units, you might have 10 spaces, and I think that would result in one handicap space. Now, I happen to know a few handicapped people, and if they can't get parking, they call the Fair Housing Act because they're, I guess, allowed parking. But how does it work for handicapped? And I mean, I know the rule is, again, one for those 10 spaces, but we got an older population and somebody can hurt their foot and they need a handicap spot.
So the number of handicap spaces is dictated by the building code. So as you're correct, I don't remember the exact percent versus total number of spaces, but that's what we're dictated. And that is the building inspector's call. I don't know if he has the authority to say, well, I think you should add more.
But I think you can call, if you're handicapped and you live in a building and you feel there's not enough handicap spaces, you call the Fair Housing Act. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure. I know a lot of handicapped people and they're just like Linnell asked questions about handicap parking. But thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Rich Bonifant, 17 Park Hill Avenue. Not quite in District C, but not that far off. It's a question thing, so I'll keep my comment of like, I appreciate my single family zone and I hope it stays that way. We'll let it go at that. I live in a B resident zone. And I did notice on some of your maps that it's turning into a C, whatever, it is, C,
CD3.
CD3 here. And then you skip it, you put a single family for a couple of streets and then you go back. And I was just wondering, was there any criteria to that? But my real question is that I understand that in typical individual cases that come before the zoning board, there's a lot of restrictions about contacting zoning commissioners and the ability to interact with them until public hearings happen, and there's rules about not contacting them after a public hearing and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of freedom here, right? This is not an individual case. You can speak to a zoning commissioner anytime you feel like it on something like this, right?
That's an excellent question, and one I have not fully vetted with our corporation council yet, because I had people asking, because, you know, if you think about it, all the commissioners are residents, so they want to go out to dinner, they want to go to the store. So if this was like a land use application, they wouldn't be allowed to talk to you once the application is submitted. In this case, I don't quite know. It's a great question. I haven't talked to the law department yet, but that's one of my things to do, because I think, so if you bumped into somebody on the street and said, hey, what's going on with this? I don't like the idea of this concept. I think that would be hard for them not to have some kind of conversation with you about that, but how in depth it should go with, or at least they should bring that back to the whole commission, so everybody's privy to the same information.
I know that happened to me once in the past where one corporation counsel told me that you could contact anybody until the public hearing was closed. And I wrote to two of them, but it became a moot point because they just forwarded to the staff and they put it in everybody's pocket or packet anyway. Okay, so, but still, I mean, we're allowed to lobby our city councilman who we elect, and you can make your feelings known to whoever you feel like, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a good question. I will make it a point to get an answer quickly and get that to the commission so they have talking points.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, yeah, I can't. I can't. It doesn't come too much. Hey, Judy, you can.
Hi, it's Judy Harris, 7 Pequot Drive. Did I hear you correctly saying that the code now is going to change to 3.5 stories as of right? Is in the in the East Norwood Village District, does that mean all the amenity stuff goes out the window? And it's just going to be 3.5 stories as of right?
So in areas that were formerly the neighborhood business zone, and also that would include the EVTZ, which is the area from 95 south to the cemetery, kind of bordering East Avenue. That stretch was, the as of right height was 2.5, and you could go to 3.5 by special permit. The proposed regulations would allow that to go to 3.5 by special permit, but they can't get any increase in density without the special permit, and they have to still provide the amenity points. I should say we are looking at the amenity points a little bit because the proposed regulations have requirements for certain size developments for solar and some other things. So if we put that in there, they basically be double dipping and get something for free. So we've come up with some other ideas, and the Planning and Zoning Commission, I think we haven't set a date yet. We're going to kind of do a sustainability roundtable, and I'm trying to bring in some speakers to talk to them about sustainable development and what that means and what you can do and what actually makes sense and costs and implications and so forth. So that's I think that answers your question. All
right, so there's more to it. All right, last thing. we keep talking about parking and this 1.3 keeps coming in. Can the building code change if the zoning code changes? Could that requirement change? Where does the 1.3 come from?
The zoning regulates the number of spaces and how big a space can be and where it can be located. Building code regulates and enforces the ADA law. So they tell you how many handicap spaces and where they have to be located.
All right, but the 1.3 spaces per unit,
That's a zoning.
that's zoning. So we could change that if we wanted to. I mean, the city, by we, the city of Norwalk.
The city could say it's 10.3.
All right.
I'd probably-
Okay, so that could address the parking issue. And it might also address the handicapped issue, which I personally am very concerned about. Because I am one of those handicapped people that were alluded to. All right, anyway, those were my questions for now.
Okay, thank you.
Dave Roger, and could you elaborate again on the 2.5 to 3.5 and the EVTZ, what is and isn't changing?
Sure. So right now, in the EVTZ, the base allowed as of right height is 2.5. To get to 3.5, you would need a special permit. The new regulations, since we combined, and this was a universal combination, it wasn't specific to East Norwalk, we combined it everywhere, the neighborhood business and the D residence zone. Because they have the same density requirements, they have a lot of other similarities. Besides, the only difference was the D residence zone currently allows 3.5, where the neighborhood business only allowed 2. So in combining that, we bumped up the EVTZ height to 3.5 as of right. The density, in my opinion, people may not agree with me, no one's going to build 3.5 without the density, because there's no point. If you can't get the density, why would you spend more money on construction? It doesn't really benefit you. But somebody could, I can't say they won't, but it does change the as of right from 2.5 to 3. The density number doesn't change. They still need to, density, that was another, as I mentioned, the density in the D residence and the neighborhood business was the same and carries forward in the new zoning regulations. So to get to that,
Density would be like-
Steve, my mic is still unmuted.
Changing from 2.5 to 3.5
stories.
stories.
That's the height.
The height. Special.
Three and a half. Give me an example of why would someone want that?
So the D zone and the neighborhood business zone, right? They're existing, two existing zones. So the existing D residence,
Steve, I can't hear anything. It's just a lot of crackling noise.
I'm gonna keep you muted hopefully, or I don't want to have to remove you. I apologize.
Well, it's not coming from me.
Uh-oh.
I'm in a closed room.
I'm gonna mute you for just a second.
Okay.
Nobody else has a mic on. There's some people online, but nobody else has a mic. Okay, so the D residence zone and the neighborhood businesses zones are proposed to be combined citywide, not just one area of the city. That was a universal change. Those two zones as they exist today have the same allowed density. Between the two is that the D residence zone, which is a multifamily, smaller scale multifamily than what you see in South Norwalk, that D zone allows 3.5 stories, whereas the neighborhood business zone only allowed 2.5 stories. So when we combine them, we upzone the neighborhood business by a story. The density doesn't change, but the height allowed is basically like another 10 feet. I think it just makes sense to do to combine the zones to make it more consistent throughout the process, yes. I don't think it has much of an impact at all. I never have. Yeah, Diane, go ahead.
Diane CC, East Norwalk. Let me start with this question here that we're talking about right now, Stephen, then I want to go back to the parking, and then I want to just ask a general question. So the option, though, was to, instead of changing everything to 3.5, you could have actually leveled the field and said D would be 2.5. Because I think you just said yourself that it's really unlikely that someone's going to opt for the 3.5 story as of right in EVTZ. And just so people know what that is, that's East Avenue Village Transit Zone, which really is the corridor of East Avenue from I-95 to Cemetery Street and then some peripheral streets. So couldn't you have leveled the field by saying then the standard is 2.5? Because you were just saying that someone is probably not going to opt for 3.5 stories as of right, and yet not take advantage of applying for the density that would require the special permit requirements in EVTZ. The reason why I'm asking you this is that there's people in the room and there's probably people online who are familiar with 1 Cemetery Street that we just went through and about to go through 49 Van Zandt Street. And the threshold to get approval for the increased density, in fact, double the density, is fairly low because the standards in a special permit, as you know, we contend, don't really protect the public. So by making the sweeping change then to bring B into line with D for the 3.5 versus having D then convert to 2.5, or just keep them separate altogether. But we already have a concern in East Norwalk with that corridor, with what's already allowed there under special permit. Because, I mean, if they get these bonus points that go with getting the approval to have the density, the bonus points we've already seen twice now are so easily achieved that virtually every application is going to be approved if they comply. So that's number one. That's more of a comment. The second part of that is I'm concerned in terms of comments and suggestions and concerns coming into you all together, because I don't want to put you on the spot, but I am going to put you on the spot to say that early on in this process, that even if 2,000 people in a neighborhood were opposed to one of the things recommending in this plan, and we assume that if it's in this plan now, after the 2 years you've been at it, that it is something you support. You said that even if a couple of thousand people oppose it, and want to see the city developed, then you would keep it in and you would fight to keep that in the plan. So that would be a concern then, to say we want, for you to say we want to hear from people and what the concerns are and what people really want change in the neighborhood, but then to say it's not really going to be taken into account. And then further to Mr. Bonifant's point, I think we also need to be clear on the question about communicating with Common Council folks. I thought you had said that this actually doesn't end up going through council to be included in the POCD. If there is a council vote on it, we want to make sure that we have access to council members to lobby on our behalf for what we want. But we also think that because this isn't a private application and it's coming through the city itself, that there shouldn't be any reason why people can't send emails directly to the zoning commissioners to express concerns. So I hope you get a ruling on that from Common Council soon. My bigger point is
You want me to
What is-
respond to any of that?
What's that?
You want me to respond to any of that?
You can. Yeah.
I can wait too. I'm taking-
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
actually
if you want to
taking
wait and then
notes.
do them all together. So
Sure.
when you take a look at District C, north and south of the highway, there's pretty large swath of B residential that will automatically qualify, go from one family and automatically qualify for two family. And so I really want to understand the rationale behind that. What is the purpose of adding that amount of density? What's the ultimate goal of what the growth is for what you want to see for the city? We've already heard you say that you want to see the density grow in the urban transit areas. But what's really this push of getting the density of the population to grow? Where is that coming from? And what number is that growth population that you're hoping to achieve with this plan? And then the final thing would be, I could go on all night, but the final thing would be back to this parking issue. I think that I've seen in other communities, and I don't know if it's the difference between what's classified as a city or a town when it comes to the municipalities, but I think I've seen other communities do their parking requirements based on bedrooms. And this is where a lot of us get hung up, because if you're talking about number of units, but you have 10 units in a building that are 3 and 4 bedrooms, there's probably a safe assumption that you're going to have more people occupying those units than you would a studio or a 1-bedroom. And so how does this relate to other communities when we're doing parking at 1.3 per unit, but you're not taking into account how many bedrooms are in the mix of all those units? And a good example right now is a public hearing tomorrow night for 49 Van Zandt Street. Permit 17 for 13 units, 2 bedrooms, 17 parking spaces, 2 of which are ADA only. So it really restricts to possibly down to 15 parking spaces. When you look at Van Zandt Street, there's not an opportunity for parking unless you're going to Guam Park. Not going to have parking. Oh, there's also shopping. Over any area, there needs to be some density.
So, yeah, we could have gone to 2.5 stories. 2.5 stories. Right off the bat, anything that's already over 2.5 stories becomes non-conforming, and I don't think that's fair to those property owners. That causes issues. I think that making this new zone, the CD4 zone, having the ability to have a little more height in the zone helps add some more density in the areas we feel is important to add the density. It's the neighborhood of business now and the D zone are multifamily zones, and where the reason why they're located. So I would not say that EBT is match to get. I think is anything easy if you look at that application? Probably a little different than the last one. If I think something, say I live an hour away, so I don't have like decision I make, it's not affecting my property. So I think I can take without having a bias or without having anything. I think that do anything but improve the city. That's the only angle I take. Other than that, interest in this outside of my pay. From the commission and other applications. I make recommendations solely based on what I think is appropriate and best for the city. That's me, in any decision. I make. So if there's 10,000 people that say Steve, you're an idiot, say that. Disagree with them, I'm going to state my reasons why I think it's a good idea and advocate for that position. You're the only ones who vote on this, not me. Disagree with me, they'll vote the way they vote, and then that'll be the law of the land and not what Steve says. It's not a dictatorship or anything along those lines. There is no council vote on this, but we will be communicating and presenting to council so they're aware, because council is going to get questions, comments, and concerns from the public. So it's good to update them and let them know where we're at and why. As I mentioned, I will follow up on the ex parte communication. I think you asked about the. Good. No. What did you change right here?
I unmuted this.
No, don't. I'm not talking super close, so I'll try to do that. Oh, really? Yeah, we tested everything beforehand, so. I'll try to talk like.
Just got a text from somebody that they're trying to watch it at home.
Okay, I'm not sure why, because we tested it before and it worked, but I'll try to speak directly into this. Maybe that will make a little bit of difference. So I mentioned with the combining of the B zone properties with the C zone properties to make this new CD3 zone, which could allow 1 or 2 family houses, depending on what somebody wished to do. We applied the metric in and around like the Route 1 corridor, where if you're a quarter mile from that corridor with the existing zoning there, then that was recommended to go into the 2-family zone. And then in areas that were already like surrounded by 2-family or multifamily zoning, we combine those and consolidated just to make the pattern and the flow of the zoning map make more sense, because right now it's very disjointed. Afterwards, if I can show you in the map, if you have specific areas, I might be able to answer that question in more detail. I don't look at this, and I think I would contend that there is no goal to increase density with that change, because you can already do ADUs there. So the ADU size increased quite a bit with the new regulations. So it's not, I don't look at it as an add of people. I think we look at it as an opportunity for somebody to have a different housing choice than they can have now. It's a potential path to home ownership. I can't say that is what will happen, because somebody could buy that, build a duplex and rent out both rooms. I can't control that. Somebody could buy a parcel of land, build a single family house and rent that out. I can't control that. That's not a zoning metric. That's a choice of ownership by that individual. Last point I thought you brought up was related to parking and why we do number of units versus number of bedrooms. It's just a different way to skin the cat. Other communities do number of bedrooms. I think we did apply that at one time, but we switched several years ago now. I think when we did rezoning in South Norwalk, it's probably 2018. We adopted those, and that's why we went to the 1.3 per unit. That number doesn't come out of thin air. That was based off of occupancy counts that our staff has done historically over time. And also that was what, at the time, the lenders would require a minimum of 1.3 spaces per unit. Lenders don't just, and some projects are self-financed, so it's a little different, but these projects that had lenders, the lender said, you need to provide X number of spaces because we think it's going to be a problem for you and decrease the value of the property down the road, which might mean that we may not get paid back on our investment we made in you. So that's where the 1.3 came from.
Before you go on, can I just clarify the parking thing?
Yeah.
So with the 1.3 and not being enough for the units that would be there, if you're using the demographics that it's so close to mass transit that the assumption is that some or many of the people won't have cars, then can there be a restriction put on development that says then that when you do leases, there could be a restriction on the number of cars that the particular tenant has, so that it controls it there? And then on top of that, can zoning require that there be assigned parking spaces in addition to visitor spaces. And the ADA, so that could be controlled by the actual property owner through the enforcement of the lease, and then that would actually help to remedy some of what we already know. I mean, anyone who lives in a neighborhood that has multifamily knows that this is going to happen. And I just want to say to your point about ADUs, you're not going to likely to have, if you're going to be multifamily, you're probably going to have a developer that's going to come in and is going to convert or build to multifamily to rent, because they can't do that with an ADU. So there's really no benefit to having that increased density to say it's multifamily, and then not to assume that it's going to be someone who's coming in strictly revenue-based to do the multifamily, because they can't rent the ADU to just anyone. So, I mean, I just think that we have to be honest about what it is.
Well, I don't think anybody can say, I think it could go either way, and it probably would on property by property basis. Some of those would be rented and some of those might be homeowner occupied, and then they may own both of those, or you could have two different owners on each unit. I mean, I think any one of those scenarios is plausible. My guess, but I can ask, I'm going to guess that zoning can't dictate the number of cars somebody has in the unit. I'm going to guess we can't do that. I can ask the question, but not part of do. In terms of the assigned spaces within the development, that's typically left up to the developer on how they want to manage that. For very complex developments, we do sometimes ask for like a parking management plan. And sometimes those get involved with, if there's different groups involved with the parking. 230 East Ave was one because you had city parking, state parking, and private parking all on one parcel. So how those all kind of interact. We do have a couple hands in the public. Hey, Michael, you can now unmute yourself.
Hi, you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
This is Michael Pavlis and I'm on Olmsted Place in East Norwalk. I too am concerned with the change of zoning of my single-family neighborhood. You are changing the value of single-family housing in this neighborhood by changing it to a two-family zone. If you looked at, another analogy, it would be like taking 1 acre zoning and allowing that owner to parcel it into 2 half-acre zones. And that would also increase, housing opportunities. I don't think it's going to go over really well in Class B zoning, just because it sounds like you want to neaten up a map.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I guess you're all done, Michael?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I don't think it's going to impact anybody's property value whatsoever. The assessor doesn't assess individuals on what the zoning could let you do. It assesses you on what your property has. So if you have a single family house, you're assessed on your value of that single family house. You're not assessed on the fact that you could do a 2-family. That's not how tax assessment works. Anna?
Yeah, hi. This is Anna. Sorry, I just want to let you know that the sound keeps going in and out, and particularly when Diane was speaking, we could hear her and then not hear her, and back and forth. So there wasn't a way to chat that in.
Oh,
So anything that you can do to make it consistent, we appreciate. Thank you.
sorry, that might be beyond my IT abilities. I'm sorry about that.
Understood.
MC?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Hi. Mimi Chang, 37 Raymond Terrace. I have a few questions I jotted down, Steve. So I'll do what Diane did and kind of just go through the, just kind of rattle them out and you can take them there. Okay. So my first question is, how are the road networks? You mentioned earlier about AAA, AA zone road networks, and how are the road networks in AAA, AA zones, quote, what you said, not made to handle density? You said that at the beginning of the presentation. If those roads, I mean, from my experience anyway, are less congested than the road network surrounding the East Norwalk train station, like East Avenue, where you're proposing to upzone from B or single family to CD3, two family. There's a valid concern with this whole zoning regulation rewrite that you're kind of picking winners and losers and could potentially diminish property values of what's mine. I'm going to speak, what are the stakeholders' largest investment, life investment. For example, you said CD4 area in East Norwalk will remain a protected area. Yet you're proposing that long-established B-zone streets like mine are not protected, that they should be upzoned to encourage density. Can you speak to that? Related to that is, how does it make sense to potentially increase population and vehicular density by upzoning B-zone streets in the EVTZ area surrounding the East Avenue corridor if you're planning to eventually line that East Avenue corridor with mixed use and 1,000+ apartment units? Can East Norwalk's road infrastructure handle all that density that you're proposing? And finally, are you, and this has been discussed on social media on a zoning, I don't know if you're familiar with Norwalk Zoning Matters community site in Norwalk, where we talk about a lot of zoning issues. This has come up quite a bit. Finally, are you and your P&Z commissioners actually physically touring and going around to every street which you intend to upzone from B to CD3 to see firsthand if the infrastructure of smaller lot neighborhoods, which are, a lot of them are already short on parking, with some homes sharing driveways and some with, which I think is an issue now, a proliferation of either boarding houses or illegal contractor yards whose trucks and vehicles monopolize parking, can even accommodate upzoning. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll try to, if I didn't capture your question all the way, just let me know and I'll circle back.
Okay.
So there was several questions related to, and I think that you started off, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Started off talking about the AAA zone and why that couldn't handle the density of the road networks there. I was referring, I don't know if I said road networks, I think I said infrastructure. And infrastructure is more than just the roads. The infrastructure can include, obviously, city sewer, sidewalks, other things like that. It doesn't make sense to add density out in those areas where there isn't infrastructure to support that. I think that's what the answer I was giving on that.
Okay, I'm pretty sure you said road networks because I jotted it down, but anyway, okay.
Yeah,
Thank
but
you.
I mean, but in general, they're, you know, it's the further you so the areas, and this has come up a lot, and I think we're going to continue to have a lot of conversations about this, the proposed CD3 zone, which is the 1 and 2 family zone. Again, we probably won't reach agreement on this, but I don't look at it as an increase in density. I look at it as another opportunity for a different type of housing. The rationales I've stated as to why in certain areas, it just makes sense to do that, in our opinion, based on the location of other surrounding multifamily zones. We've also tried to apply a metric to where they're located based on infrastructure, job centers, and transit locations. So as I stated, the closer you are to those key points, such as a transit node, that's where we have the most dense development. And then as you fan out, then you can get to the less dense. Then you might fan out to like the 1 or 2 family. And then the further away you get to is towards the single family zoning. So we tried to apply that metric kind of evenly throughout the city. Norwalk is, it's not a circle. If it was a circle, it would be pretty easy, but Norwalk's kind of, the way it's developed is kind of like a cross. If you think about the major road networks, east, west, and north, south, and there's spurs off of that. So it doesn't always line up perfectly with what we would like to do, but we tried to apply that same buffer around there with the goal of, if we get the zoning districts correct, the lines on the map can change if over time the city needs to expand in certain areas or contract, you can just move the lines based on the needs of the city at that time. But the idea now is to get the districts correct, and then we'll, over time, things are going to change. The city's going to continue to grow. We don't have a goal in mind. That's not how we think about things. As I stated, our principles are, we've identified areas where we think we should grow, and that's where we're focusing the city's investments and the city's infrastructure. I might have missed some of your questions, so if there's not something I hit, please.
Yeah, going around, I know that Miss Tabachnik, Anna Tabachnik has made it a point to go around to different neighborhoods that are being upzoned to get a feel for the neighborhood, to get a feel for, I mean, you cannot deny, Steve, there's a proliferation of cars that are parked on sidewalks, that are parked on front yards, that are clogging up roads. So that was my final question. Are you all as a group, are P&Z commissioners going around to the different neighborhoods to get a flavor for what is actually going on currently? For example, my street, I've been there since 2006. The top and the front end and the back end of my street, all of a sudden, there are homes where cars are literally spilling out and taking up the on-street parking. I have seen contractor yards working out of very small lot parcels. This very area that you're talking about upzoning. Has your team gone around physically to each street to check out that some of the homes share driveways, that some of the homes, you can already see where the concentration of the on-street parking is? Have you gone around to see if those streets can actually accommodate what is definitely what could happen if you upzone from B to C3? We have a lot of older folks on our street who aren't going to be here that long. Maybe they're going to sell their home. And what if someone comes in, decides to do a duplex on a lot that's not even, it's barely a third of an acre, and they share a driveway with the house adjacent to them? Have you gone around to see if these types of streets, which you are proposing to upzone, can actually handle the capacity that could potentially happen on those streets?
So tomorrow night there's a Planning and Zoning Commission meeting, and I will reiterate your request to the commissioners if they haven't done so already. I can't answer for the 12 commissioners if they've done that or they haven't done that, but it's a fair request. Second, I think maybe it was just missed, or we've been talking a lot tonight, but anybody that's going to build a duplex, they're going to have to conform to the zoning code. So they have to provide 4 compliant parking spaces on their property.
Okay.
A lot of those houses, they have 1, maybe they have 2 compliant spaces, maybe. So if someone's going to start,
Okay. All right. Thank you.
state statute would, we have a definition of zoning regulations. The definition of family is any number of individuals related by blood or marriage. So I can have my sister, my 6 cousins, my aunts, and my uncles. We can all live in my house. Might be small, but if I have a house and I can fit all these people in there, I can have them there, and they all can have a car. I can't say they can't have a car. I can say if you're going to have, etc., and what the service is like. If they decide to park on the street, that would be a different issue for the city to deal with, which I talked about, that residential parking permit program that we're thinking about. There's not just, that's a separate side piece. I know they're related because the way people live now, and this goes back to one of the reasons why we're proposing to add some additional opportunities for housing with the duplexes, and then expanded the CD4, which is the D-resident zone, a little bit. And also it's top 5 or top 3 in availability. solve that problem. I don't work for any of those communities. That's a, they're dealing with their own problems. When they don't do that, they get stuck with 8 G applications. Decisions they made. Can't control or make recommendations what happens in Norwalk. About 8:15. Question, I'm not sure. We just have another question.
Lisa Roger, and I have just a general question. How would you compare the East Norwalk with its locale, with the train station and village, to Rowayton, which also has a train station with not regular stops like Stamford or South Norwalk, and has a village in relation to the
So I think that the key difference is but their station is not within their commercial corridor, so the main would they look at adding, example, adding that idea a little bit. We don't know how to proceed, but, the tree.
Parking. So my question concerns the Water Street area. From Bridge all the way to Max Street. According to the plan, it looks like it's to be determined. I'd like to just ask what the criteria is going to be in determining what that's going to be zoned as. And second question is, when can we expect some type of an indication of what that area is going to look like, or what it's going to be zoned for? And is that the final discussion about this planning? That's what it looks like. Question with the people.
Yeah. it- Conversations with Common Council right now about the it's also pretty complicated. It's complicated section of the city. Water side of Water Street. There are so many competing interests and pounded by the fact that it's in the flood zone, that the harbor management plan requires water dependent uses for those parcels. strong opinion on what we should be doing there. The Harbor Management Commission has a strong opinion. Council members have different opinions. And the property owners, they don't agree. So we're trying to come up with something equitable and manageable that preserves those really important businesses there, but then also, I'd like the Water Street facing piece of that not to look like it does now, because I think it's. Water dependent uses because it's just not safe in some instances, but we do want to improve.
Let's be
Lives. That's another goal we try to achieve. You know, waterfront property is super valuable, obviously, like you stated. So trying to have it be something more than it is now in certain areas. So we're trying to look at a couple different options to the puzzle to see see if there's some things we can do for that. Plan. I thought I had a plan received positively, so I was going back to a plan B and a plan C. So we'll present those. This process for
Public input possibly before the planning process starts. I mean, consensus of what everyone really would like. With the planning process for that. I mean, so the zoning obviously is modernizing and doing that you've done. I think a lot of people seem to be taken back a little surprised, obviously, in the room. So I think that a piece of property that we probably should have a little more public input.
So
When making.
if you email me, I can send you the link to the plan. If it's easier for you to navigate it that way, but I can tell you, as part of that process, outside of the gentleman, the business owner who has that ice house business up by, we talked to every business owner and every property owner that abutted the study area. We sat down with each one of them, talked to them, all their names are in there. We got all their input on what they wanted to see and what they wanted to do. We had public meetings to get public feedback on some of the things we were thinking. So I think from that perspective, we got a lot of input, so we have a good idea what people want. It's just like I said, it's a lot of very distinct visions for that area that don't always connect. And so trying to get something that everybody's going to be happy with is what I got to try to figure out. So that's my to-do list for starting tomorrow and the next.
It's a familiarity that the least profitable use for properties go there.
It's
Right, I understand.
it's all economic.
Okay, and so maybe you can define that, and then to say, were there portions of places that were downsized, and how did you define that from where it was?
That second part might be trickier without looking at the map specifically and looking at the change from like a particular area, a particular parcel to one of the new zones. But upzoning usually, density is the easiest way to think about it, but upzoning usually means like I was in a single family zone and now I can build 50 apartments on my property. So now enhancing your ability to do something on the property on that. Downzoning would be kind of like taking away rights that you had previously. There was a lot of that kind of conversation when we did the industrial zones rezoning about a year ago, 6 months ago, because there were some properties on like Meadow Street, for example, where we took a lot of uses away that they could do because we found those uses were not appropriate and kind of noxious for the areas that they were in. You know, nobody wants the proverbial belching smokestacks next to them. So a lot of those were taken away. So in that perspective, they would look at that, I was down zoned in my ability to do so.
So that was more tied to use than it was to density.
Yeah, it
So-
could be that, or it could be heights, or it could be setbacks, for example, could be also wrapped into the conversation, but that's less impactful than, or less easier to consider than. the
Okay.
density.
So I think people should understand that when we go back to the point that was made about, when you start to look at some of these maps, it does seem that there were winners and losers depending on how you think the city should develop. And I think people should keep that in mind. On the interactive map itself, I have a technical question.
Mhm.
When you click on one of the parcels and you're using the little toggle, like if I went on my house, I see what it's zoned for now, and I use the toggle arrow, and it shows what's proposed. In some of the other parcels I clicked down around town, it had more than one option for the proposed zone. There was like proposed like 1, 2, 3, 4. Does that mean that those haven't been decided yet, or?
I haven't
Okay.
seen anything with 1, 2, or 3, or 4. The only areas that have more than 2 would be something that has an overlay zone.
Right, I saw those like EVTZ in our zone, but I saw one, I think that even had 6 options, and it was north of the highway, still in District C. I can try to find it again for you, but
If you could,
I wanted
because
to know what that meant, so when
I
we
don't
can
think
explain to
it
people.
could be an error. I'm not sure. I'll have to, I have some really smart GIS people on my
Mhm.
staff. I'll let them-
Okay. And then the other question, the final question I have has to do with the density increase. At the beginning, I think you mentioned that throughout the time where there's been the possibility for increased density from 1 family to 2 family, historically, most people haven't taken advantage of that. I think you said less than 50%
Yeah.
of what would be eligible today. If you were to extend that and say that that would be the same equivalent going forward, say over the next 10 or 20 years, at that percentage rate, have you considered what the impact is on the city as a whole in terms of infrastructure and services and schools, fire, police? All of the regular city services as well, when you add that density on?
So I mentioned, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, when we've done the broader rezonings in the past. The last example of one was Merit 7. So that rezoning, I think, was 13 or 14 acres, which pretty much was the entire west side of Glover Avenue from Grist Mill Road down to the Glover Avenue Bridge. Pretty much most of that area. That was rezoned as one big project, and that went into as part of a master plan that the developer is looking at, which we thought was a good idea because the merit office towers are there. So they're there, we need to support the towers. As part of that, we did a super detailed look at, and they were required to do some of this anyway. We looked at the effects on water. We looked at the sewage impacts from that. They also did their own financial analysis in terms of property taxes and revenues to the city. And we also did like a 3-phase look at traffic. And so the approval for that project was based on phasing of the developments tied to significant infrastructure improvements that the state was looking at. The first one, they can do 1 phase as of right because there was already the whole corridor was developed. So we said, okay, you can do the southern piece. Before you do the middle piece, the state of Connecticut needs to actually finish the Route 7 Merit interchange and fix the bridge at Glover Avenue. And then if you want to do the third phase, the state and the city is going to need to fix the Grist Mill Road intersection and that section of Main Avenue that just backs up to ungodly lengths in the afternoon and the mornings. That has to get done before you can do the third phase of your project. So we tied the approvals to that. So we do look at those things. The type of changes we're talking about here. So if I say Street A can now have, it's a single family street, but now you can do 2 families as well. Based on what the historic development pattern has been, those changes are not going to happen overnight. There, in many of these areas that people could do the 2 families now, they've chosen not to do that. So the impacts on the roads, the impacts on schools and everything else are going to happen so incrementally that it's not a measurable metric at this point. What I think happens with any development, they have to go through, before they can get approval, they have to go to WPCA, they have to go to whoever supplies their water. They say, here's what we're proposing. How does this fit into your plan? Do you have the capacity to handle that? And, you know, we've looked at this 5 times over the last 5 years. WPCA has had no issue with capacity. Capacity is there. The water companies have actually forecast a decrease in water demand. And people don't always agree with this, but what happens is when the properties redevelop, the infrastructure that was there, it's 50 years old, 40 years old, it leaks, it's bad. The new lines come in, they're much better shape, obviously, and the new fixtures and things put into the projects, they use and consume a lot less in terms of water. So they're actually forecasting a decrease, which is the direct opposite of what you see, but that's their state file plans. You don't have to believe a word I'm saying. Go read their plans. They're online. You can look at it from the state of Connecticut. It's not Steve making it. No, it's the actual engineers and the professionals who make these determinations, not my opinion. I ask them, they tell me. Okay, you can look at the data and believe it or disbelieve the data. I can't try to convince you. And we'll be here till 12 o'clock arguing about it. I don't want to do that. Any other questions before we wrap up? It's a little after 8:30. Yeah. Do you live in Norwalk? No, I said before I don't live in Norwalk. No.
How many?
The entire commission is volunteer Norwalk residents. 91 and change. I don't know the exact. No, we don't set goals. You're not allowed to caps on things.
Density. Some other towns like, well, I don't care. I could drive from the Darien today. It looks like the same place it was 50 years ago.
That's
So maybe they listen to their residents. And these other towns like Westport and Canaan and Darien, they listen to their residents.
a really loaded conversation, probably for another night, because it gets way more complicated than I think we should get into.
I don't think that should be a decision based on 10 or 12 people. Making a decision, party of the residents of the city.
I don't think I would agree with that statement.
Also, then I look at that like the people in the zoning and the commissioners, it's like they own the city, and they make the decision, they don't listen to the residents.
No, I think that they follow. So I'm going to try to do this quick because I don't want to be here till 10. So we have what's called the Plan of Conservation Development. We call it the citywide plan. The citywide plan sets out the vision and goals for the city. The zoning regulations try to mimic that plan, which is kind of the process we're going through now. And that lays out, here's where we want to develop and why. We, the city. So that plan is some. So that's a plan that's actually adopted by the Planning and Zoning Commission and also by the city's Common Council, which was unanimously adopted by both bodies. So your elected officials say, we agree this is a good direction the city should go.
Stephen, let's say, no, can you clarify a rule for us too? That's already started from the first meeting. So
Did you start the room?
I didn't start it myself. And I try not to deal in them, so that's why I'm asking you too on this question. So how many planning and zoning commissioners are there now with the combined commission?
11.
Okay, and so I think it was posted somewhere yesterday that of the 11 commissioners that would be voting on this, none of them lived in a district or their parcel would be impacted. Do you happen to know, or?
I haven't looked at that. We never looked at it. I would say, yeah, I can say that there's a change of, everything is, the entire zoning regulations are changing, so everybody's property.
Right, on the council, but you don't get to vote on that, yeah, because I mean, it would be just something to say, I mean, if you had 11 or 12 people.
Yeah,
and
we
nothing's gonna change
didn't,
on there,
I don't
but-
even know where some of these people live. I have a general idea. I don't know what street some of them are on.
Mhm.
If they think I'm making a bad recommendation, they're gonna tell me, so. That's what their job is.
And then I'll just say, because I know that you don't want to debate this in public, and I get it, but for the sake of the public that's here, I always feel compelled, like I have to take an opportunity when I know people are either watching or they're going to rewatch this. So from the public point of view, and I think I really pretty much have my finger on the pulse, at least in East Norwalk, if not the whole community, that when you talk about the zoning commission's responsibility to be able to adhere to the plan of conservation and development, the master plan, that plan was not embraced by the community. So be it as it may, Steve, you know, there was a lot of.
I have to cut
pushback
you off
on
there
it.
because
So,
we've had this conversation before.
But I don't want the public to think, yes, they're using this document that, you
But I-
know, this is the plan,
And
but
I'm
but
not
there was a
gonna
lot
make
of
it
concern.
I'm not gonna make it a political thing because that's not.
No,
my
it's not,
place.
I'm not making it political,
But
I'm
I
saying
think
that
when
there's.
when you have, what's typical of land use, which is why I said this statement, but at the last, it's not a popularity contest. You can't make decisions by people who, when something's going on in their neighborhood, they react to it. And most people, sometimes they react negatively. And that's called NIMBY a lot of times too. That's a very common acronym that's used. I would pose this question to anybody in this room. Tell me what project that's been built in the city from a land use project, not saying city budgeting, anything like that. What land use project has negatively impacted you? Please, I would love to know what is major quality of life less? What's major property values less than it is today? I'd be shocked if you can name a project.
Well, I
Not
think,
the project you like, but one that's negatively.
Right.
impacted.
I think part of the fear is that not whether something has come to fruition. Like we know some of your commissioners say people were in an uproar over, proposed projects that got approved and then they didn't really impact everyone. But when we look at something about the scope of the change that you're recommending here, especially in East Norwalk proper, we're talking about large portions going from single family to two-family zoning. And so you might say that the probability of that ever happening is very low. And if it does happen, it's going to happen over a long time. But residents like me who are property owners look at it and say, but this could happen and it could happen tomorrow. And what's going to be the impact? And for you to say that the justification are plans that the commission has to adhere to legally. But that's why I feel it's important to say that it's a plan that was A, not popular, B, had a lot of pushback, and residents feared exactly what's happening today with this back then. And that's what's coming to fruition. It's not political, Steve. It's
No, but
just,
Diana-
it's a sentiment that I think that you and
You
the
know,
commission.
And again, I think from my perspective, I think when usually things come out, people come out because they're opposed to something. And sometimes they don't always understand what they're opposed. They heard this was bad, so I'm going to come out and say it's bad. Well, okay, that's fine. That's your prerogative to do so. I talk to a lot of people who like the plan. And I think that's probably a function of who I talk to versus who you talk to. If you talk to probably people of a similar mindset to you that oppose the plan. So I don't think anyone can say that that's representative of the city because all the people that I talk to versus the people that you talk to. I'll say that if the common council members that had to vote for on the plan to approve it and the commissioners didn't think it was a good plan, then they shouldn't have been voted for the plan. And we should have said, change this part of the plan. It's a bad plan. That's why we went through that process with them. There was a 30 plus person steering committee on that. I don't remember anybody on that steering committee saying bad plan. I mean, there was probably things that we didn't like. We worked with harbor management quite a bit on some changes to the plan. But at the end of the day, then they didn't come out and say, don't vote for the plan. So I didn't hear those conversations anywhere, and I was involved in all of them. I don't know what else to tell you. Okay, I gotta have dinner, so thank you very much.
You post this PowerPoint, there's slides there, if you saw before that are no, when it's in.
Hold on one second.